as well to Faye and Gaby for sharing today. We will kind of just get started and we'll hear from Faye, and then afterwards there's some time for questions, and then we'll hear from Gaby as well. Are you happy if people have questions to just ask or?
Yes, sure.
Okay.
Okay, my name is Faye Morris. I'm Noah's grandmother. I'm Michal and Yael's mother, and I was a foundation member of Australian Hashem Hatzair. I was in the first Sofim Bogrim group that we had. So I go back a long, long way with Hashem Hatzair, all the way to 1953. When Hashomer was formed in Australia. Now, for a very long time, I didn't consider myself as a Holocaust survivor. In my eyes, Holocaust survivors were people like Gaby, who survived ghettos and hiding places, maybe camps, and as an adult, I realized my rucksack of trauma that I collected during the Holocaust, and that my Jewish identity was tied to the Holocaust. I was born in January 1938 in the famous Jewish city of Chelm in Poland. Now, those of you who know anything about Chelm know that Chelm is the city of the wise men, of all the wisdom. But Jews came to Chelm in the 16th century, and Chelm had a golem. The rabbi of Chelm created the golem before the golem of Prague. And he was just as famous as the Golem of Prague. Chelm had a famous yeshiva, and in the 1930s, it had a very rich cultural Jewish life. Now, my parents both came from working class families, and they were both communists. My mother, if you looked at her hands, her crippled hands and her nails that were pulled out in prison, was first arrested at the age of 14. And they had to let her go because that you couldn't put someone in jail until they turned 16. So the day she turned 16, my grandmother told me, they came up to her attic room, took my mother, and took her two older boys. She said they took her breadwinners. And so that's my background. Now, when the Second World War started, Chelm was on the border. The River Bug was the border after the Ribbentrop and Molotov Pact. Poland was divided and the River Bug and Chelm was on the river. And we were on the German side. But before the Germans came into town, the Red Army came in for 14 days. And when they left, they said there was a huge contingent of left-wing youth in Chelm. The communists, the Bundes, Hashem Hatzair, the left Polizion. They said to them, anyone who wants to go to the fatherland, come with us, because the Germans are coming in. And a lot of the youth of Chelm left at that time. But my parents didn't, because my father was the secretary of the Ibsektia, of the Jewish part of the Communist Party, and he had responsibilities. So he went into hiding. Apparently he hid in the attics. And he stayed. So my family stayed. And then a few weeks later, one of his Polish comrades came and said, Aaron, you've got to go, because the Gestapo is picking you up in the middle of the night. They know where you are. So he came to my mother, and she ran to her sisters and brothers and said, we've got to go. And they had a peasant with a boat and rowed them across the River Bug into the Soviet fatherland. So they escaped. And the unusual part about us is that they escaped as a family. There were 6 siblings, and they went. So that was the unusual part. And when they got to the other side, the only one who had any language to speak to the people on the other side was my grandmother, because she was born in Brest-Litovsk. And she came from quite a well-to-do family, so her father educated the 3 daughters as well as the sons. So she could read and speak Russian, which was a great plus. And they settled near the border because no one imagined that the war would go on for years. They thought they'd go back home. And they were in a village with very primitive peasants, and they were given a job as lumberjacks. No, that was the last thing they could do. They couldn't cut trees. They were Jews from a shtetl. There was a dressmaker, a tailor, a shoemaker, but lumberjacks they weren't. The interesting part that they always told about that time is that part of their wages was paid in vodka, and they were not drinkers. And
Well, your dad really liked his vodka?
yeah, yes, he would have that much vodka and about 2 glasses of soda water. But the peasants would barter this vodka, which they didn't drink, for anything they wanted, because they didn't take clothes with them, they didn't take provisions, and they could barter the vodka. And one day they said if they stay in this village, they'll die, because they couldn't do the work. So the men went off, left the women and children. There were 3 children. I was the eldest, my cousin Lisa and my cousin Blonia. And they started walking, literally walking, till they found a train, and they ended up in Gorky. Now, Gorky is now called, has gone back to its original name. It's now the great host of Novgorod, like it was before the revolution. It's on the junction of the Volga and the Oka River, and it was a great industrial town. Gorky also had an ancient Jewish community, but they didn't welcome us because they had their own tradition, they were Orthodox, and we were strangers, and they were very frightened that we'd report them to authorities for keeping religion and things. But it suited us very well because there was a synagogue for my grandmother to go to. And so Gorky became a magnet for all kinds of Jews, all kinds of refugee Jews. And then in 1941, when in June 1941, the Soviet Union was attacked by the Wehrmacht. And my father, one of his brothers, my aunt Rosa's husband, and 2 other Jewish men from Poland were called up to join the Free Polish Army. And there were 2 Free Polish Army. There was Anders army, and the mustering point was in Tashkent, Uzbekistan, and that's where we had to go. Now, when Comrade Stalin told you that you had to do something, you did it, or you got shot. So they packed luggage, they took their children, and there were 5 Jewish families with children, and they started traveling to Tashkent. The Luftwaffe bombed the railways, so it took us months to get there. They were rather naive, so they were robbed. Their luggage was lost, and they arrived in Tashkent, they were destitute. They arrived at the end of 41. It took them months to get there. Well, of course, the Free Polish Army wasn't going to sit in Tashkent and say, we're waiting for these stragglers who are Jews, because Anders' army was quite anti-Semitic. There was another Polish army, and they consisted of Polish communists, and they were welcoming to Jews, but that's not what we were told to go. And we arrived in Tashkent, and there was a typhoid epidemic, and a lot of the adults got typhoid. The children of these 5 families, we all got measles, we got pneumonia, and I was the only child left alive. Because we had no food, we were malnourished, we didn't have a roof over our head. And that's where my first memories are coming in. I slept in the doorway on my mother's coat, and it was winter. And my father, who had typhoid and was in the infectious diseases hospital, used to give his food rations to a Polish nurse who used to smuggle it out under her cape and give it to my mother at the gate, and she fed it to me. We just had nothing. And my aunt came out of hospital with her head shaven. She looked at her husband and she said, Leon, where are the children? And I believe he just cried, because there were no children. We struggled. I have vague memories of that time. Funny thing is, I remember that we were in a tea house, and women were not allowed to in a tea house because it was men's domain in a chain. And they were Muslims, they didn't let women in. But they let us in, they felt sorry for us, because my aunt was carrying her dead daughter in her arms. And somehow I remember that my cousin was wearing my coat and my hat, a pink coat and hat, which was obviously too small for me. And she was lying on this table. And I just have glimpses of memories of odd things. I remember a woman giving us a bag of carrots, because we must have been begging. We had no food. But slowly we got the opportunity, and we traveled back to Gorky where the rest of the family was. And the news that greeted us was terrible. As we walked in, and my grandmother said she didn't know who we were. My aunt had her head shaven because she came out of this infectious disease hospital. And we were like walking skeletons. And she looked at us and took her time to recognize who we were. And she had news for us. She said to my father, we have a telegram from Minsk that your sister and her child, from your sister's husband, who's in the Polish army, that he put Frimet and her child on a train to join us. And she said, and in the paper it says that the train's been bombed. And I remember my mother screaming. So I have memories like that. But somehow we were lucky because we survived as a family. And this, there were my mother's siblings and my father's brother and his wife. And this is a photo taken after liberation, 1946, with all the children that were born in Russia. And I think there were very few families who survived the way we did. Just pass it around. I have good memories from Gorky. I went to kindergarten. We had to learn music, we had to learn ballet. And it was compulsory, and the good students were taken out and sent to special schools. I wasn't the talented musician or with the wildest stretch of imagination, a ballerina. But the opportunities were there. And the other thing I remember from Gorky was that we lived in surrounded by gardens, and it was an old nunnery. So there was a passage and nuns' cells, and in each cell lived a family. So we had one small room, it was a nun's cell. The ceiling was very high, most probably like this. And my father and his brother got some wood from somewhere and they lowered the ceiling because you couldn't heat it. It was so cold. And there was a bed, it was a single bed where my parents slept, a couch, and I had two brothers. There was a cot for one brother and a pram that my other brother slept, and a table and 4 chairs in the middle. But the thing I remember, that there was a Polish-Jewish club, and my father and his brother would go after work and they'd bring people home. People came from the villages, from the kolkhoz, from whatever surrounding of Gorky, who had to come, Jews who had to come to town to fix something up, to get some documents, or just dropped in. They'd go to the club and they'd bring them home for a meal, and they'd sleep the night or a couple of nights. And in summer they slept on coats on the floor in the corner. Winter they slept on the table. And I remember asking my mother, why did they sleep and went on the table? And she looked at me as if I was stupid, and she said, because they wouldn't wake up in the morning, they'd freeze to death. But all these strangers, and I thought we were unique, that they only came to us. But a few months ago, I was talking to my cousin Lisa, and we were talking about those times and what we could remember. And we remembered quite different things. And she said, so you had all those old mods coming to you too? I said, yes, they were Jews. They brought them home. And I said to her, it only misfired once, my mother told me. At the station, my uncle and my father coming home from work saw this young Jewish woman who was sitting. She was wearing rags. She was destitute and she was crying. And they got talking to her, and someone must have been staying with us because she didn't come to us. She went to my aunt and uncle. And my aunt Apparently she was covered in lice, so my aunt cleaned her up, shared her clothing, and clothing was very hard to get during the end of the war. And she was at my aunt's for weeks, and then they introduced her to someone, and she was getting married. And she didn't ask my aunt. There was a bit of a reception, and she didn't invite my aunt. She invited everyone else that she was introduced to. And my cousin Lisa looked at me. She said, "You don't know who it is?" I said, "No, I don't remember." She said, "She married my uncle, and she didn't want people to know how destitute and poor, and your aunt cleaned the lice off her, so she didn't invite her." So that was it. But they're the conditions we lived under. Anyway, the war finished, and in 1946, Stalin said that, and he was sure of Poland, that Poland was in the communist bloc. He said that Polish citizens had permission if they wished to go back to Poland.
And how old were you at this point?
I was 7.5 or 8. I think I turned 8 just before we left. So in March 46, we left Russia to go to Poland. Now we traveled in goods trains, and that I remember quite well, because the men built shelves in each wagon, and on each shelf traveled a family. And it took months, because wherever we came to Poland, we couldn't stay there, because Poland was, if you see pictures of what the Russians are doing to Ukraine now, that was Poland. It wasn't ruins, it was rubble. And to this day, I remember when we pulled into Warsaw, and my auntie, my Uncle Leon's wife, was from Warsaw. And she said to him, "Let's go for a walk, I want to go past where we lived, and my mother's house." And within 10 minutes they were back, because there wasn't a house, there wasn't wood there. It was just rubble. And it left an impression to this day. When I started seeing pictures of Ukraine, I just got pain. I said, that's what I remember. That's what it was like. And anyway, we were told to go and go and go. You didn't have a choice. We couldn't go back to home. And we ended up in Lower Silesia, which was the territory of Poland that had belonged to Germany, that was given to Germany after the first, because until the First World War, there was no such thing as a Poland. Poland was divided into 3. There was a Russian section, there was a German section, and an Austrian section, and the Duchy of Warsaw. So this was in the German section, and we were sent to a small town called, the Germans called Reichenbach, and the Poles renamed Dzierżoniów. And we arrived at the end of June, and we were sent to school, and it was a Yiddish school. It was the Peretz school, and by that time I was literate in 2 languages, but I didn't know Polish. I was fluent in Yiddish, which was my mother tongue, but I could read and write in Yiddish with a Hebrew alphabet, because my parents taught me when I was a little girl. And I went to school for 1 year in Russia. and I learned to read and write with a Cyrillic alphabet. And then we were sent to a Yiddish school, which I was rather pleased because I knew Yiddish and I could read and I could write. And as an adult, I realized to add to the anti-Semitism we experienced when we returned to Poland, that school was a schoolhouse in the church ground. It had Jesus on the wall. It was taken from the Catholics and given to the Jews. So to add, I didn't realize that as a child, but I realized it as an adult. It just fed anti-Semitism. Because for the first time in my life, I experienced anti-Semitism. Our Polish neighbor who lived across the corridor said to my mother, "Oh," because they sent all the Jews there. "Oh, I didn't realize there were still so many of you left." And I believe that comment was common.
And we still hear that comment today.
Yes.
Oh, I didn't know that you guys still existed. I thought that you all died out.
Yes. You know, and she was a nice woman. She got on well with my mother. Her surprise was genuine. But we never walked to school by ourselves. We always traveled in a group, because if the Polish boys caught you by yourself, you were beaten up, and they asked you why you crucified Christ. Or they'd throw stones at us and yell, "Jew, go to Palestine." And I'd come home and I'd say, "Why did we crucify Christ?" And my mother would say, "Oh, we didn't, the Romans did." And then the war started, the War of Liberation started. But the trauma I experienced when we came back to Poland was just enormous. There were cases in attics, there were cases of soap made of human fat. And these cases were found by children. And the parents would report it to authorities, and the rabbis would come, and there'd be funerals. Or there'd be mattresses and pillows full of human hair. And again, there'd be funerals. And I would stand with my parents at the graves. And they'd bury these things like Jews bury a human being. And I didn't realize how marked I was by those experiences. Now, I'll tell you how we left Poland. Every few days there would be lists of survivors from the Red Cross on doors of Jewish institutions. There was a synagogue in town, but we didn't go to synagogue. On Jewish institutions, and as soon as the list would go up, people would run, the adults would run, and they'd check the lists, and they'd make notes. And apparently, I didn't realize, but the same thing was happening in Jewish communities all over the world. And my mother's cousins, who sponsors us out to Australia, said every so often there'd be a list on the Kadima doors. And as soon as word was out in Carlton or St Kilda Shul, they would have a list. People would run. And we got some letters from overseas. And we got a letter from Australia from a man who called himself Charlie Eisen, and he wanted to know whether we were related to him. and he asked specific questions, but he finished his letter saying his name was BaSalon, like my mother's maiden name, and even if we are not related, let him know, and if he can, he'll sponsor us, which was a very generous thing to do. And letters were exchanged, and then we got a letter from Argentina, from cousins of my mother's, and there was a large part of the family, and letters from Brazil. And the letters from Brazil, we really didn't know them, because they were my grandmother's niece and nephew, and of course she left Brest-Litovsk in the early 1900s to be married to my grandfather. And my mother said, Esther, Esther. Oh, she says, I remember we went to her wedding. And an old man, my mother was about 7 or 8, and she could remember that Esther married an old man. And the story was a very Jewish story, that Esther's fiance went to Brazil and saved enough money to bring her out, and her father said she couldn't go unless she was married. So she was married by proxy. Like ancient royalty used to be married by proxy. And then she could go, and an old man stood in for the bride. So my mother could remember that. And all these people offered to sponsor us. And the reason we came to Australia is the Australian visa came first. And I must tell you, after the Second World War, things were much better organized. First of all, in Paris, there was a point. You went to the Australian embassy, you saw a doctor, you had a medical, you had an interview, and you waited for documents if they were going to let you in or not. Now refugees have nowhere to go. Anyway, we left Poland in September 1948 on the last legal train out of Poland. And after we left the border, the communist government of Poland closed the border, because my mother's cousin wrote that they can sponsor the whole family, but of 2 families at the time, because you have to own your own house, and you have to guarantee that if the person you're sponsoring can't get a job, you will support them. And although there were 6 siblings here, only 2 were in a financial position that they could sponsor people. Paris was full of hotels, and we were supported by the American Joint Organization because we had no money. They gave us some money to live on. And all the hotels were full of survivors. And I was 10, and I was just listened to their stories. And there were stories of ghettos, and there were stories of the camps, and of the loss of children, the loss of families, and I absorbed all their experiences. And slowly they became my experiences. It was just, I was very Jewish. I had a very strong Jewish identity. And somehow I took all their experiences. I won't say it's baggage, but it's their experiences and what they lived through. And it became mine. And coming to Australia was like a different planet. My mother's cousins were wonderful, but there was a whole community here, and they were so pleased to see us. And my mother's cousin Charlie's wife, Fanny, who was from Lublin and didn't know us because she met him here, she made a home for us. She bought second-hand furniture. She polished what needed to be polished. She rubbed it down. She painted beds. She put new mattresses. Her trade was she made quilts, European quilts. She put a new quilt, new pillows and sheet in every bed. We came like, we didn't expect it from a woman who didn't know us. And Charlie had a car. We came to Sydney. We came on the train from Sydney. And he picked us up and brought us to their place. And she took one look at us and she said to her daughter, Pearl, neem de Kinder Häuser schlief. Pearl, take the children and buy them shoes, because my shoes got small in Paris and they had no money for shoes. So my father took a razor blade, cut out this part here and at the back so my feet wouldn't be crippled because they were small for me. And my brother, it was the same for my brother. Pearl took us to a shoe shop and she bought us a pair of school shoes like Mother bought her, and a pair of sandals. And I've never had two pair of shoes in my life. Anyway, in Australia, we settled down very well because we had family and a lot of love and support. And my mother couldn't believe that I could go to high school and they didn't. If I was clever enough, I could go to high school and they didn't have to pay for it. Not only did Fanny tell her that, but she went through each cousin and to check whether it was true. And every time something happened, she said, just study well so you can go to high school. It was the most marvelous thing. Then I had a very strong Jewish identity, and my parents were still very left-wing. And they had friends with children older than I. And these children belonged to very left-wing organizations. And when I was about 14 or 15, I noticed many of them married out. And I didn't want to lose my Jewish identity. By that stage, I went to Yiddish school. I think I'm talking too much. And I did a lot of Jewish history. I loved history. I still love history. And I went to a camp and I met someone from Hashy.
What's the name?
Richard Flats. He passed away just a few days after my 80th birthday. We were friends all these years, no matter where we were. I still have two friends who are living in Israel. One was my Madrid of Golubovic in Yiddish, and we write to each other weekly, and I correct his Yiddish weekly, because, and Tzvi Solo in Yirim. It's an old friendships. And we talked for all night. And he said to me, you know what, you should come to Hashy. Because I said to him, I just don't want to lose. I'm very left-wing. I believe in socialism. But I really don't want to lose my Judaism. So I did my research and I joined Hashy. And that's all I'm going to say. But I realized that my baggage is the Holocaust. It's most probably the greatest influence on my life and decisions I made. I wanted to live a life that I couldn't replace the children, the 1.5 million children that we lost. But I wanted to live a life and bring up children who sort of go in their footsteps, not replace them, but go in their footsteps. And you, Gaby, it's all yours.
Thank you, Faye.
Oh yes, if you want to ask questions.
Little question.
Yes.
The man Charlie who sponsored you, were you actually related to him in the end?
Yes.
You were?
Yes, he was my mother's cousin. But my mother didn't remember him because he left Poland in 1920 to go to Palestine. He was 20 and my mother was 7. So you can imagine they didn't have a relationship. But his wife, she was just, you know, if there's a Jewish saint, that was Paddy. She just gave of herself. She gave love. You know? This is it. Yes, he was. And I must tell you about the cousins in Brazil. When we came out to Australia, we travelled first class. We had 2 cabins. Jews didn't travel first class, they travelled in the hold. You had to have a lot of money because our tickets were paid by the cousins in Brazil, whom my mother didn't know. So we always spoke of the wealthy cousins in Brazil. Then in the 60s, my cousin Sabina, who was from here, went traveling and she met a young man in New York and she was getting married in New York. And my aunt and uncle went, in Yiddish you say, Hassan and Martin, to marry off their daughter. And I said, seeing that they're in New York, they'll go to Argentina and see the cousins, and they'll go to Brazil to see the wealthy cousins in Brazil. Well, the wealthy cousins in Brazil were working people who sold their furniture and possessions to pay for us to travel first class. It's just a remarkable thing. And so one of the cousins had already passed away, but Esther was alive, and they brought her out here for about 6 months, about the time Michal was born. And she was here for 6 months. They took her everywhere. They took her to Sydney, they took her to Queensland, but her best place was the Hillsville Sanctuary. She used to say, neem me to the Australische Geierlach. Take me to the Australian animals. That's all she wanted to do. Just take me to the Hillsville Sanctuary. And she had a good time here.
Thank you.
I think all of you know that I'm Maggie and Rafi's grandmother, and I just found out that I'm 3 weeks older than Faye. So I was born in December 1937 in Warsaw, and my parents were a middle class family. My grandfather owned a printing establishment, and he had 5 sons and expected them all to work there. And my father also had 4 sisters. And my mother had 3 sisters and 1 brother. So they were a very large family with all of them married with babies at that time. And they all lived in the neighborhood. We lived on a street called Gansha Ulica, and when the ghetto was sealed, it happened to be the Gansha Ulica was incorporated in the ghetto, which was lucky for my parents because that meant they had an apartment to live in. They weren't destitute like a lot of people who were brought in from the countryside. And but I'll start from the beginning. When Hitler invaded Poland, I was 18 months old, so my memory of that time is very limited. But I was trying to think what was my first memory of the war, and that was when I was 3 years old. So I had no memory until that time of what was happening to me or to my parents, because it's just blank. But when I was 3 years old, I was with my grandmother on a balcony, and I remember this very clearly because that's just an incredible memory. I was playing on the balcony, and I think it was the 3rd floor, and there was a pram with a baby, and grandmother was minding us. And I was looking down on the street, which was just a pleasant street. People were strolling around their business, and suddenly they started running. And it's very strange when you see people running like ants virtually, rushing here and there. And 2 trucks came full of soldiers and blocked the end of the street, and soldiers came and started grabbing everybody that was within their vicinity. It was a wapanka or a roundup, and they just grabbed everybody, put them on the trucks. Men in one and women in the other, and there was nobody left on the street. I called my grandmother. When she saw what was happening, she was horrified and just took us quickly inside the building. And I don't know what happened then, of course, but I know that that was my first memory of the war. And so in 1940, the ghetto was established, and everybody had to wear the Magen David armband, the yellow star. And Mom was very brave. She didn't look Jewish. She spoke perfect Polish. And what she used to do was take off her armband and somehow manage to get out of the ghetto. And she used to go and get food, which she secreted on her person, like pulses and pieces of meat, which she would bring inside and then put her armband on. I think they were, at that time, they were still early days, there were still areas that they could enter through various doors. I don't quite know what I know. I heard about that from a relative only recently. She lived in Florida, and I didn't know about this, but she said that she was there, and my mother used to bring food, and my grandmother used to make huge pots of soup for everybody, because at that time people were starving already. They were sealed, there was no way to get food, and anybody in the building or in the street who could smell food would come and be fed. And that was, I had an amazing mother. And what she did also, at one stage when she was out of the ghetto, she was on a tram, and the tram was going around the bend and slowed down a bit, and suddenly a man grabbed her handbag and rushed off and got off the tram because it was going a bit slower. So she started screaming because without her documents, she was lost. Luckily, the conductor was nearby and there were lots of witnesses. So she went to him and said, "You've got to help me." He took all my documents. So the conductor said, "Well, look, we are nearly at the terminus. I'll go with you to the commissariat and explain the situation." She also asked a couple of other people who saw what happened to walk with her, and they went to the police station. And as she was walking, she had time to think of a name, a different name, but of course she was in a hurry, so she picked up Krakowiak. I don't know if anybody knows that the Polish dance is Krakowiak, and I was very unhappy with that surname because I used to be teased. Do I know how to do the Krakowiak? Because every child knows how it's like doing it. And so that was one thing. And then she decided that it would be safer for my father to be my uncle and her brother, because he didn't look as kosher as she did. So she picked a name for herself, and I've got documents here of her false papers. Maria Krakowiak, but she was born in Warsaw, but she made Rutki because we had family in Rutki, and she made I think I'll pass these around because they're in copies. And she made my father Henryk Kowalski, and this was gold. It saved her. Well, it saved me, and it saved my father to have that, proper false papers signed with the swastika and everything. It was just the most amazing thing that she did. But she was just incredible. And then she decided that it would be safer for me to be out of the ghetto. So she found a convent which had an orphanage not far from Warsaw, in a place called Stara Wieś. But they were reluctant to take me on because it was an orphanage and I wasn't an orphan. It so happened that the Mother Superior's name was also Gabrielle, and she took me in, and also Mama, I think, contributed quite a bit of money. One thing I must mention is that I didn't know I was Jewish, because what does a 3-year-old know, especially during the war? Nobody did anything. And Mom did not look Jewish and spoke Polish, and I spoke Polish. Also, I don't know if you know, but if you speak Yiddish at home, you can't speak Polish properly. There's just something, you get an accent, and it's very recognizable. So, as it happened, my mother's mother, my grandmother, died when Mom was 9, and they had Polish maids, so she never learned how to speak Yiddish. So she spoke a Polish like a Polish person, and went to school, of course, and she was very, very lucky. And this is how you survive this war. Luck or fate, I don't know, but Mom just could do things that was very hard to believe after the war, that she managed to do all the things she did, because she was just brave. She would get out, do the things she had to do, bring food, bring clothes for everybody, and then put on her armband and become Jewish in the ghetto. Now, when she took me to the convent, by that time the ghetto was properly sealed, and you couldn't get out except through one particular gate. And she wanted me to have some clothes, so she put 3 dresses, one on top of the other. And I also had what's called a kożuszek. I don't know, are there any Polish speakers here? Probably not. It's like a fur jacket with made out of lamb skin, and the fur is on the inside, and outside is decorated, embroidered. And of course I was walking like a penguin, and the German guard at the gate was laughing when he saw me. And he opened my jacket and looked at all the dresses and started counting. And this I remember, he went, 1, 2, 3, and he was laughing. And my mom said she was just shaking in her shoes. And he said to her, that he had a little girl my age, and I was blonde at that time, and he thought it was funny, so he just waved us on. And that's when I went to the convent. Now, the convent, I stayed there 3 years, and I don't remember a thing. Oh, no, that's wrong. I remember being very sick. Once I had rheumatic fever, and somehow they got word to my mother that I was dying, and she came. And through the haze of illness, I knew she was there with me. And unfortunately, I went to sleep. And when I woke up, she was gone because she couldn't stay there. So that's my only memory of the convent. I have photos of the convent because apparently they were taken by the Red Cross. And I have no memory whatsoever. And this is amazing how the brain, the mind works, that you completely obliterate the misery, because I was, from 3 to 6, a little girl without her parents, just in a strange place. But I did learn this. and that was very important, because there were lots of Jewish children hidden in convents. And if you didn't do it properly, you were found out. So I was lucky that I learned it, and I could do all sorts of things. I did believe that I didn't know I was Jewish. I thought I was Catholic, and God was going to help me. So the next, I just noted a few things. Yes, now I got better after I had rheumatic fever, and I was told also that soon I would be leaving the convent. Why? Because Mum had heard that the Germans were closing all the convents and orphanages, and this is well documented, that they heard that there were children being hidden, Jewish children in convents, so they decided to close all the convents and send the nuns and the children to concentration camps, put them on the trains. Luckily, again, I got out before it happened. So that was already in 1944. And Mum took me to some Polish people, a couple who had a little girl my age. And I stayed there for 6 months. It was, again, not a happy time. And I don't remember very much about it, but I do remember that she was wearing my clothes, and I was very indignant about it, but there was nothing I could do. And in 1945, in April, I was 7 years old. The Germans were retreating and the Russians were taking over Poland, that section. And Mum was on her way to collect me. There was no transport, she was walking. And a few kilometers before the place where these people lived, a neighbor of theirs rode past her on a bicycle. She had wanted to surprise them, but he got there sooner, and she arrived just as I was being dressed in my own clothes again. This is a fixation with a young child. I think own clothes meant some sort of security. She took me out of there, and Mum and she told me that we're going to live in a place called Otsforsk, which was just a few kilometers away. And we were walking through the forest towards Otsforsk. And I was so happy to be with my mother again. And we stopped in a clearing, and Mum said, "Look at this little squirrel." I did, but when I turned around, there was a man standing next to my mother. And I had not seen my father in 4 years, but I knew instantly who he was. We all three cried and hugged and kissed and cried some more. Such happiness. We walked towards Otford's holding hands with my father and mother. How gorgeous. We lived in Otford for the next 2 years. Again, I did not know I was Jewish. In fact, I did not know what Jews looked like, but had been told they were responsible for the war and they were bad and evil people. And we still kept our false papers during our stay in Otford. That was already after the war. And I was told to call my dad uncle. And I never questioned why, and this is very surprising, but I think I was such a, a child that undergoes this is so traumatized. You're just told to do something and you do it without questioning. Because when I think now, why would I call my father uncle? We lived in a small apartment, and like Faye mentioned, my parents spent their time, a whole year actually, looking for anybody alive. And when I mentioned at the beginning that we had so many my parents had so many brothers and sisters, and they were all married, and there must have been about 20 or 30 little small children, their offsprings, and it was a very large family. So they expected that somebody would have survived, but nobody did. They waited for a whole year. Finally, they started going to orphanages, and I often accompanied them, and I was looking at the children. I would say, this little girl looks gorgeous. Maybe she's a relative. No, we could not find a single person. After 2 years, that's from 1945 to 47, we stayed in Poland till we were sure that there was nobody alive. Now, my father had a sister who lived in Australia. She left in 1935 to marry with her husband, who had a brother here. It's another story. And also my father found that he had some relatives in France. They were distant cousins. So we decided on our way to Australia to stop in Paris to meet these relatives. And once we were in Paris, I was very sickly, and I was diagnosed with TB. And then my parents knew that they couldn't enter Australia under these conditions, and I had to get better. So they decided they had to stay in France a little bit longer. It turned out 5 years. But I was sent to a sanitarium and got better after a few months, and the lesions healed. And I forgot to mention this. After I heard about such bad things about the Jews when we were still in Otfordsk, I asked my father, what does a Jew look like? Because I had no idea what Jews looked like. And he led me to a mirror and said, look. And I remember looking at us both. He nodded his head, and I was shocked. And yet suddenly I understood all the secrecy that I had to call him uncle, that we had false papers, and why we were leaving Poland. It was a very, very traumatic time for me. I didn't really want to be Jewish because I had heard such terrible things about them. So I had to accept that. I still wanted to have my first communion, but we were living in Poland. So my parents did a very wise thing. They never ever interfered with my wanting to go to church or my saying my rosary at night. They thought eventually I'd get over it, which I did. So that when we were living in Paris, I just decided that it wasn't for me, and that was that. We stayed in Paris for 5 years, and my parents decided to have another child because Dad had started a business. He bought into a printery, and everything seemed to be going well for them, and they loved living in Paris. We had lovely relatives there, and Mum gave birth to twins. It was only as she was being delivered that the doctor said, I think I can hear another heart. And at the age of 40, my mother gave birth to a boy and a girl, which was in those days they said, oh, a miracle. I mean, giving birth to twins at that age. Unfortunately, she became very ill afterwards, and but she got over it. And why did we end up in Australia? Things didn't continue well for us in France, and Dad decided that it was time to try Australia. France was very hard to live in unless you had money, and we came to Australia. We had a house in Elwood, and my brother and my sister were 3 years old, and I was 14. Yes, 11 years difference. And I went to Macrob, then I did pharmacy. I think it was a good life. It has been a good life. I think that's about all. I forgot to mention that when we were in the ghetto, Mum mentioned that to me, that she was on the street when Janusz Korczak was led to the trains with his group of children. She said she would never forget that. It was a very moving moment. Everybody stood still and waited till they stopped, till they left. Out of respect for him. It was a very, very, very traumatic thing. He was offered by the Germans to have freedom because he was so well known throughout the world. But he said, no, if the children go to the trains, I'll go with them. And they all perished. So, a hero, another hero, there were heroes everywhere. But he's remembered, and I'm glad of that. And my mother has been dead for over 20 years. And Sandra, you've got that photo of Mum with the gefilte fish.
I gave it to Rafi.
My son did a photo of her, and that featured at the Jewish Museum on one of the journals.
Again, feeding people.
A common theme.
Pass it around.
Gabby, how old were you when you may have mentioned when you arrived in France and Paris?
I was 9. I was 7 when the war ended. We lived 2 years in Oxfordsk, so I would have been 9. Oh, yes.
Do you want to explain that one?
That's the twins and my parents and I. But that would have been, well, John and Nanette would have been about 7 or 8 at that time.
you ever feel your life was in danger as a young person?
Not really. I don't think I thought at all, really. I just existed, you know, you just go along, you don't really think. But I do remember another momentous feeling I had was when we were on the train leaving Warsaw to go to Paris and then to Genoa, and at that time we thought we were taking a boat directly to Australia. We didn't know we would spend 5 years in Paris, in France. My father said, now you can use your normal name, forget about the Krakowiak, you can be Gabrielle BaSalon, which was our family name. And suddenly I felt so happy. Here I was my real self. I became me. I felt that something important had happened to me, that I had my real name and that we were real people again. Because all the 2 years in Oxford, we still had false papers. There were still pogroms, which I didn't know about, but there were pogroms. As you mentioned, they used to say that they hadn't killed enough Jews. There were still too many around. I didn't know all that. But
See, I knew about them, and the reason I knew is that my auntie Sonia, her parents were comfortable. Her father was the miller in Helm, so they had the mill, and they had a 3-story house next to it, which they had lots of tenants. And so when we came back from Russia, she said she was going to Helm to sell her property. And she had the documents for some reason, that it was, that it was her family property. And she caught the train, and we heard, in Georgianov, we heard terrible stories, Jews being pulled off trains and murdered. And my uncle was left with 2 little girls, and she went to sell her properties, because there were no telephones. The communication was very slow, and he didn't know where she was. Apparently she arrived and went to the mill, and the boy who worked for them was now the miller, and he recognized her because she was quite young. He took a butcher's knife and he was playing with it, and he said to her, Pani Sonia, Mrs. Sonia, there's nothing for you here. And she looked at this knife he was playing and looked at him. She turned around and caught the next train back, and she came and she told the story. Of course, I was all ears. We all were. We just, and we realized, and he said to her, it doesn't matter about the money from the mill and the building. You're back home, you're not going anywhere.
well, this is why my parents kept their false papers. They knew it was still dangerous. But they had a holiday house in a place called Yanin. That's where my father was hidden during the war. It was led to a couple, and then he was hiding there inside it. And after the war, they came to see us in Otfotsk, and they wanted to legalize the transfer of property. And I was surprised they could have just taken over, but they wanted to be sure that they would have it. And my parents couldn't do anything except give it to them, because like your relative, they would have been denounced to the authorities as Jews, and that's not what they wanted. It was, we were leaving anyway, and and they said it's not going to be worthwhile. So they signed over, and I remember that because they came to see us, and I said, "Who are these people?" You don't have to know about it.
My mum used to say, you don't have to know about it, you don't have to know everything.
It's amazing that our stories are different and yet similar.
Similar. But my aunt said he didn't threaten her or say anything wrong. But he was playing with, he was putting the knife from hand to hand and playing with it and said to her, "Mrs. Sonia, there's nothing for you." He knew who she was. And so she turned around and she thought life was more important.
Yeah.
You know?
Thank you for sharing. If anyone has any other questions for either or just to talk about.
What made you come to Australia? Did you have family in Australia?
Sorry,
Why did you come to Australia?
Oh, because my parents were unhappy in France. They were financially finding it difficult, and that seemed to be like a. My father had a sister here, and she kept saying, "Come, well, it's a better life here." And so we did, and it was good. Yes, it was. Dad could compare life here to life in Paris. You know, we lived on the 4th floor in a very small apartment. I mean, life in Paris is glamorous and all that. At first, my parents were delighted to live in Paris. They went out every night. They just loved the freedom and everything. But after the twins were born, they had more responsibility. So they decided to come to Australia, and they bought a little house in Elwood, which is still standing. I wish they hadn't sold it.
Like our North Carlton.
Your father came to Australia twice.
Yes, he did. Oh, I thought this was going to be boring.
No, it was quite.
So when was the first year he came?
Sorry?
When was the first time he came?
Well, Mum was pregnant. She was expecting only one baby, and they thought, and I think they were crazy, but they thought that Dad should come to Australia and organize a place for us, and I would help Mum with the baby, and we would come, on a boat. It's easy, and he would take all the luggage. All we would have would be just what we needed, and then we would be together again. He stayed 6 months. He hated it, so he went back to France, and by that time things had changed in France. After the war, there was everybody was exuberant. Then there was this lull. He had earned more money working as a compositor, which is what his printing ability was in. And so he could see the different life that the children would have, an open fresh air there. You had to go to a park in order to go for a walk. We were still living on the 4th floor. So he decided again to get the whole family to go back to Australia this time. He had brought all the luggage back. So now we had all the luggage again, So we have a lot of these anecdotes, which I thought they might be boring.
People are like that.
Sorry.
I just wanted to know how your Jewish identity was impacted, because you said you didn't know that you were Jewish for a long time. And when you discovered you were Jewish, that was quite traumatic. But do you feel Jewish like today? Do you feel?
Oh, I felt Jewish straight away. Yeah. I felt that there was something different about me to the others, but I didn't really. I'll tell you what, I did feel Jewish in Poland, but I started feeling Jewish in France because have you heard of Rue des Rosiers in Paris? It's where you can get all the Jewish food, and Mum would send me to do some shopping in Rue des Rosiers, and you could buy herring and pickles, and they were in barrels, and they were, Jewish life was like in Israel probably in some areas, and it was, I suddenly felt, oh, this is terrific. And also in France we would have Pesach, and we would have Rosh Hashanah. Although my parents weren't religious, I also had a Christmas tree, but I felt Jewish. I felt, and also we had family, and we did things together, and so it was gradually I started feeling Jewish. Yes.
And you went to a Jewish youth movement. You went to
They were, but I
B'nai B'rith.
didn't get a chance to.
Did you go to B'nai B'rith?
That was here.
Oh, when I came
yeah.
to Australia.
Yeah.
Oh yes, when I came to Australia, I joined B'nai B'rith. Yes. Oh, a bit of Havonim too, I think.
Nothing's wrong with that. Social Zionist youth movement. Don't react.
My Seder
I didn't know about customary in those days.
You know, it
I
doesn't
think
matter.
I just did what everybody, all my friends at school were going to Havo.
Yeah, so.
And I just did.
Yeah.
That's okay. We ended up at Hashy anyway.
I'm wondering whether your parents spoke about their experiences, through the war and the Holocaust, as you grew up, or whether that was kind of pushed to the side.
Yes and no. They didn't really want to talk about it very much. And I was doing some work at the Jewish Museum, and they asked me to interview my mother. So I've got that recorded, and that's very helpful because every day I remind myself how stupid I was that I hadn't asked Mom about this or about that, and especially when I was jotting things down, I thought, why don't I know this? And it's really irritating that I know so little. But it used to upset her too much. That was another thing. She used to really start crying, and I didn't want to do that. So I can't say that I spoke to her that much, but I did know. I mean, we used to talk about things.
I feel like our family can relate a lot to that. Just some stuff.
My brother and dad never spoke about it.
And if I asked my mother, she used to say, why do you need to know? And I used to ask her things. I said, I want to know such and such. Why do you need to know? And she'd get on with it.
Mom used to get upset if I asked too many questions.
I think it was hard to build a new life. There was a lot of pressure. And maybe they didn't want to burden us.
Well, it's very hard for you young people to imagine living in a country that's occupied by the enemy, that you can't do anything, that they want to destroy you, and you have to be very courageous, very smart to outsmart them, and you are totally without resources. I mean, when you heard about the ghetto, Warsaw Ghetto uprising, you think, how did these people have the guts to do anything? I mean, against the German army or against, it's just when I remember them running in the streets and being caught like animals and escorted to the trucks. You just wonder how can it be that this is what happened? And look what's happening now in Ukraine. I mean, it's just humanity has got that gene. And until that gene disappears, there'll be wars. And
We're a predator against ourselves.
I can't see that happening.
No, picking up your point, my grandmother kept a copy of the Argus newspaper. It was one of the newspapers here, because on the front was a photograph of a nurse who looked like her late sister. And there were no photos. There's one photo of Naja, but because all of the family left on both my grandparents' sides were killed, this photo reminded my grandmother so much of her sister, she kept it. And that's, I think, you know, once they got through, once they started living life again, she didn't talk to us about it.
No.
But when she was prompted, like, she just had this random newspaper that we had at your place, just because she couldn't move past it.
And to pick up Gaby's point that Jews spoke Polish like Jews, the Shomrim might be interested. Because I was teaching Yiddish too at U3A, I had a student who said to me, her father was one of the leaders of the revolt in the Warsaw Ghetto. He was a member of Dror. And she said to me, we've got 2 books of my father's, and it's a biography, I think, of Mordechai Tenenbaum, who was a leader of Dror, but he was the commander of the uprising in the Białystok Ghetto. And she said, my mother wants to ask a favor. She doesn't read Yiddish because she landed in her first concentration camp at the age of 12, and then she was in 6 camps. But she would like if you would read these books and underline every time my father's name is mentioned in the biography of Tenenbaum. And I did that. It was a fascinating, beautifully written books by Mordechai Tenenbaum's sister. And I learned a lot reading it. And then when I finished the second book, I went to the back and there was a glossary of every ghetto fighter on which page their name appears. But I wasn't sorry, I read it. And then I went to meet her mother, who was in the 90s, and we got talking. And she said to me, which movement were you in? And I said, Hashy, here. She said, my husband used to tell this funny story about Mordechai Anilevich, and I think you should know it. He came from a shtetl, really, and he spoke Polish like a Jew. And she said if he was ever caught by authorities in the Warsaw Ghetto, he developed a stutter. And when they asked him questions, he used to stutter. And they used to say, let him go, he's an idiot. And of course, he was the commander of the revolt. He couldn't put 2 words together in front of authorities. And I said, he's an idiot, let him go.
So he'd hide his Yiddish accent.
Yes, because if he answered them in Polish, they'd pick him up as a Jew. And the other thing I want to tell you about Anilevich is he didn't have to be in Poland. At the beginning of the war, the conference of World Hashemite was in Romania, and the leadership of the movement was at the conference, and he and his partner Mira were on their way to settle on their kibbutz in Palestine. And then they said, you can't leave the Polish movement without leadership, we need volunteers to go back. And he volunteered to go back. So this is something you can sort of remember about the leadership of and the quality of those people, because they looked after their Hanchim. If the Hanchim lost parents, they had soup kitchens, they looked after them, they fed them, they cared for them. And they were a community of the youth movement. Yeah.
I think we'll maybe, and unless people want to talk more, wrap up here. Once again, thank you so much to Faye and Katie. It's so important to hear, you know, their experiences and our history of our people and our community. So I hope everyone has, you know, can take something away from what we heard about today. It is the sort of week of Yom HaShoah and the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising commemoration. So tomorrow night is the JCCV's Yom HaShoah event at Glen Ira Town Hall. On Tuesday, August and the AZYC are having a Yom HaShoah event. And on Wednesday is SCIF's Warsaw Ghetto Uprising commemoration. So if you're free, I encourage you to go to one or several, all of these. You might see me there. And yeah, again, thank you. Chazak. Chazak ben Mats.